Hello and welcome to the UK column. Today I am joined by Matt Errett. Welcome back to the programme, Matt. It's been a little while since you've been on. How are things going?
Oh, hi, Mike. It's always a great pleasure to join you, and keeping busy. The world's giving me a lot to think about, so I'm having, at the very least, an interesting time with our crisis. I don't know if it's necessarily optimistic, but it's interesting.
Well, of course, most people know you live in Canada, and Canada clearly in the process of being encircled at the moment as Trump aims to get hold of Greenland. How seriously do you take these this desire for Canada to become the 51st state then?
I try to think like an oligarch. You know, I try to put myself in the shoes of of one of these Dungeons and Dragons game masters who are trying to treat humanity like it's a board game. And there are games within games, and you know, when you take a step back and you recognize, as we've all worked to do, the deeper conspiratorial undercurrents shaping many of the big developments throughout history, we realize that there are. Though most people we live with think very short term, moment to moment, paycheck to paycheck, those who don't worry about such things and are incubated in a different cultural matrix than your average person who goes to a community college or whatever. But if you're part of these upper echelon families, you do tend to get trained to think long term, deep past, deep future, and act accordingly. So, not saying that that's good. I'm just saying that that's what we're dealing with, is a quality of thinking that most average citizens are not used to dealing with. So on the short term, I don't think that necessarily I would expect to see Canada falling into becoming a 51st state. But in the longer term, I do see that perhaps as the consequence of, let's say, a manufactured blowout of the transatlantic system, which could and will, unless very drastic measures are taken, which I don't see currently, where and who is pushing the type of necessary measures that I know would be possible and necessary. I don't see it. So what I would see as a consequence of the lack of action, appropriate action, would be the breakdown of supply chains, the blowout of a major financialized speculative bubble in the period ahead. What day we don't know, what time we don't know, but we're living in it right now. Currently speaking, I do think that the ambition to expand a jurisdictional control over Greenland, over as much of Canada as possible, over much of, Mexico, Latin America, down to much of South America, is part of a plan. I think there is a blueprint to get there. What the details will be step by step getting there is underdeveloped in my mind. I have many hypotheses, but I don't think that Carney is here for a reason. I think it's been many years of planning to situate him and to create the terrain that would be ripe to impose him as the replacement to a Justin Trudeau. I had originally recorded a segment back in 2013 when I had a podcast there going through the origins of the bail-in mechanism and Carney's specific role working at the Bank of International Settlements with Mario Draghi in formulating the bail-in regime. This is back in 2010 that he was doing this while he was governor of the Bank of Canada. And I did a presentation where I made a point that it was as though he was being situated to be highly placed in a political position, the way that the media was portraying him as a great hero in the zeitgeist. The type of language was something I'd never seen used for a civil servant at any regard. So I got the sense even then that there was a preparation to impose him as a much more competent, albeit dangerous, high priest of banking. I think that his job currently is to play a very important role, a very highly valued role to his masters within the city of London and broader imperial structures. And I do think, though, that he was assisted, whether Trump knows what he did or not. I'm going to reserve judgment for the moment, but I would say that he would not have become the Prime Minister of Canada had the decision not been made to begin the language that Trump deployed to make Canada the 51st state, which triggered a subconscious fear factor embedded multi-generationally across most Canadians all over. Maybe not Alberta, but most Canadians have a fear of America. It's been baked in by design since the 19th century. And Trump or whoever wrote his speeches and created this plan invoked by design that, such that Pierre Poilievre, the conservative, not to say he was a good person, but definitely would have given people more to work with than Carney. He failed to succeed where all polls favored Poilievre before the election, and then after the 51st state comments began, then everybody was induced to rally around the big red comfort logo of the L, the Liberal Party L, and Carney, who was the embodiment, the archetype, who was going to be the great savior, just as he saved us in 2008, 2009, while he was running the Bank of Canada. He saved us from the banking crisis, and so he's going to do it again. And that's what happened. So I do think that there's part of a gaming out, a planning factor in a lot of this, which most people I know don't pay attention to.
Okay, that's the reason I asked that question in the first place, of course, was because of his speech at Davos, which got all kinds of traction on social media and all kinds of people thinking that this was the most amazing thing that they'd ever heard. And of course, what was he talking about? He was talking about this idea of middle states. Now, you'll have to remind me who it was. You sent me a video clip that you thought was a source for that speech, and I sent you a video clip of Bronwyn Maddox from Chatham House, which I thought was the source of the speech. But nonetheless, what we seem to be seeing is amongst some of these types at that level, clear agreement on a sort of policy that has been introduced at Davos by, and Mark Carney is the mouthpiece for it, this idea of the middle states getting together to fight the two big beasts of the world, which is now the United States and China, of course. So I mean, what do you think he was expressing at Davos? And where do you think the policy has come from?
The person I was hypothesizing was Jeffrey Sachs, who bragged just a little bit after Carney's speech at Davos. He bragged how proud he was of his former student and how he knew that as he was teaching a younger Carney that he had all of this great potential, and now he's seeing it manifest. What a proud mentor he was. So, there's that. But I think that this policy was largely formulated in its current incarnation in the ascension of Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And Pierre Elliott Trudeau gave a 1969 speech describing the new configuration of the middle power policy of Canada, because it is a middle power. It's not a strong power, but it has influence. And he said the policy, when he was asked, what is your policy objectives by a journalist, he said to create counterweights. That's all he said, very ambiguous. But what that meant was whenever the geopolitical Manichaean balance of the Cold War, which was premised around this dichotomization of, capitalism are the beings of light and freedom and democracy, and then communism is the authoritarian, anti-freedom, darkness, and everything had to always be sort of balanced on this game board, such that whenever the geopolitical point of gravity moves a little bit too much towards favoring, let's say, an advantage towards the communist authoritarian side, then Canada would take a leap and give its support to some policy measure of a Reagan or of a Thatcher or what have you to balance it out. And then inversely, whenever the gravitational center of balance would move towards the capital side, then Canada would throw its love over to Fidel Castro or to the Soviets in the 70s, which was always the way Pierre Elliott Trudeau managed it. And I think that was part of a mathematical sort of cybernetics mechanism of control, of influence, to use Canada as an asset within a broader terrain to advance the agenda of those who control Canada. Now, people might say, well, isn't it Canadians who control Canada? Not at all. Canada is a monarchy. It's run by a privy council office, governor generals, an entire unelected civil service, which is an enshrined deep state structure, which is baked in to our Constitution, so-called, since the 19th century. Most policy decisions don't come from Canada. It comes from these groups and an array of think tanks that are loyal to the Roundtable movement. Like we have the Canada International Council, which is sort of the analog to the CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations, which is a big policy-making bureau. We have the Canada 2020 think tank, which was what created and installed Justin Trudeau and shaped much of today's Liberal program. It brought in many of the behaviorists around Barack Obama to play a big role in that as well in the 2008 to 2014 period. So, we have this whole subterranean mechanism that is loyal to systems of of transnational empire, far removed from anything here in North America, even though, and so what does it want? Well, it wants feudalism, it wants hegemony, it wants to get rid of the nation state system, which has been a troubling innovation over the past few centuries, which has resulted in giving the people a means of defending themselves from empire itself, right?
Right.
And so everything that I interpret the actions by those who are its devoted servants in political positions as tied to that general grand objective. Now, what are the greatest threats to said objective today? I think China and the Russian alliance together have provided a troubling disruptive influence of certain civilizational forces that are not willing to necessarily acquiesce to the depopulation reset agenda the way it was formulated in over many decades, and especially China, which has managed to keep control over its banking system. It avoided a major color revolution where many other nations failed. It expelled George Soros many decades ago and has been able to unleash a type of paradigm of long-term anti-zero-sum thinking, which provides for large-scale infrastructure to be built that empowers nations who work with China, businesses, and people who also benefit by that infrastructure. Despite the slanders that we might hear from a lot of the three-letter agency-run media outlets that try to say something otherwise, the facts do speak for themselves. China did eliminate a massive amount of poverty, 1 billion people pulled out of poverty in a relatively short time. And it's made that offer to the world, to the United States, to Europe, to many countries, to say, if you want to break out of the Titanic that you're on, shift gears and stop pushing war with us and instead work with us on building projects that will benefit you and create a foundation of trust building and of other things. So far, we've been very hard-headed, and instead we've chosen to accelerate the economic, asymmetric, and other kinds of war in and around China. And I think Carney's current objective is to try to do his part in loosening the China-Russia alliance by trying to put a new kind of language to repair the broken relationship that Canada and China have had over the past decade. It was completely annihilated over, especially since 2017, when China realized what a dangerous beast Canada was, and they canceled their Canada-China free trade agreement, which was a decade-long plan, which they just canceled by simply allowing Justin Trudeau to land in Beijing. Nobody was there to greet him, and the same day he was forced to get back on the plane, fly back in embarrassment, thinking that he was there he was supposed to arrive as a hero, finalizing this long-awaited trade deal. A solid message was put forth saying that China is no longer interested in the offers of tapping into Canada's resources, which are abundant and underdeveloped. But that was the promise. If you work with us, we'll create all sorts of advantages and you'll be able to access resources that you need. But China, I think, recognized at that time that if they allow that dependency, then those taps could be turned off at the whimsy of those who would otherwise wish to destroy them. And they chose to instead keep their destiny locked in with Russia instead, even if they're going to be paying a little bit more than what was being offered by Canada. And I think, the Meng Wanzhou, Huawei scandals, the arrest of the two Michaels, all of these things were the consequence of these battles. A lot of, the Canadian government had come in, forcing China to disinvest from its various mining interests in Canada. So there was a very hostile battle, and I think almost a healthy battle that had occurred because of China's realization of what Canada was. But I think now with the new strategy, Carney is able to say to China and the Chinese elite, look, you're being bullied. We're being bullied. You have a hostile America on your backyard. We have a hostile America. We're different now. And Jeffrey Sachs has been sort of, for those who have noticed, for the past couple of years, he's been creating an intellectual terrain on the media circuits to try to persuade the Chinese intelligentsia that there is this healthier, Carney-like statecraft waiting to come into being that wants to work with you, which is more enlightened than the big baddie Americans. And to what degree that persuasion has been working, I don't know. But I think that is what is applied and what Carney is trying to do right now to basically provide to say, okay, look, we're gonna be able to work with China. We're gonna have a new special relationship, and he's walking a fine line because it's a bit difficult with what the narrative has been built up to do in the U.S., which is the Trump's whole mandate. A lot of his narrative has been around the idea that China is our existential enemy that we have to mobilize our resources against, even if that means sanctioning Canada. So there's certain consequences to narratives that don't mesh, that are creating these interesting dramas, and I'm curious to see how that unfolds.
So obviously Carney in China, what was it, 2 weeks before he went to Davos? Starmer in China, we're recording this, Starmer is still in China at the moment. Can China stand up to being propagandized by 2 such illustrious world leaders?
China's got some pretty smart people running the show, and I would like to think that they've got a pretty good handle on the duplicity of these groveling schmucks who are. I really do think so. Now, does that mean everybody in decision-making positions is that wise? I mean, I wouldn't say that either. That people like Sachs have been working very, very slowly and patiently, building up followers. He brags how he lectures regularly in Beijing universities and has been doing that, training Beijing technocrats, or not Beijing, but Chinese technocrats and people who are in influential positions to adopt his way of thinking. Now, keep in mind, this is the guy who, despite what he says now in denial of what he did oversee for the IMF the complete rape of Russia under perestroika. And I don't believe for a second that he was simply misguided and thought, he meant well, but bad things happened by accident. I don't believe that in any way. I think that he was very self-aware and got exactly what he wanted and has been trying to rebrand his disastrous policy. But he's the guy himself is a religiously devoted Keynesian cyberneticist. He's given lectures at the London School of Economics on the importance of everybody to pay fealty to the doctrines of John Maynard Keynes, as well as the doctrines of Lord Bertrand Russell, the godfather of cybernetics, which he's also a believer in as far as the language of power projection and control of systems.
So just for people that don't know, just explain what you mean by cybernetics.
Yeah, that was a certain computing. It was a language of control developed after World War II by Norbert Wiener and advanced also by John von Neumann. Wiener was a disciple of Lord Bertrand Russell in Cambridge when Russell was still publishing his famous Principia Mathematicas, which professed to try to basically control all knowledge of the world in a radical positivist manner, rooted in certain limited axioms and postulates that he said if you just get enough data plugged into your, basically a computer formula, you would be able to, with those limited axioms, be able to linearly extrapolate into the future and past all possible knowledge, becoming effectively omniscient, kind of like having an oracle that gives us access to all knowledge that could ever be and ever would be and ever was, with his formula. But he said it wasn't practical, it was too theoretical, and he challenged his disciples, of which Norbert Wiener was among the brightest, to find practical ways of applying this to manage human systems, which was always the idea, or create a lens through which we could analyze the new science. The new scientists could analyze and interpret all systems of reality: biologic, ecologic, astrologic, human, sociologic, you name it. And so that became.
Do you think modern AI systems are being built on this model?
It's entirely built on this model, yes. So Norbert Wiener and his work on the human use for human beings and his actual literal book Cybernetics, which was funded by eugenics bankrolling Josiah Macy Foundation operations, which is what gave rise to the Macy Cybernetics conferences that, again, were funding eugenics in Nazi Germany and Canada and the U.S. throughout the 20s and 30s. The 30s. That's what was funding cybernetics. And in his books, he's very clear that machines will. Well, first he starts with the fallacy that the human mind is a form of machine that uses essentially computer-like feedback loops to a central mechanism that simply plugs in data into patterns. Where those patterns come from or what gives meaning to those patterns, in his mind, is metaphysical absurdity. Don't think too much about that, because that gets us into the realm we're not supposed to go as slaves. But from there, he says, based on that fallacy, which he says is true, that we can know that these primitive binary computing machines that were being developed by John Nash and others, in the World War II, that he was a part of, would eventually become, as he says, self-thinking, could become self-reproducing, and such that this approach to automation, he said, would inevitably, deterministically render more and more human beings irrelevant in time. So he did completely create the foundations, yes, of the current AI cult that does believe that human beings are these ultimately inferior, useless eaters that have to be made redundant and exterminated by some imaginary future singularity moment, which was, colored by people like Julian Huxley and Pierre de Chardin in the 1950s. They added some detail to this omega point, or whatever you want to call it, that gave rise to the language that was refined by people like Ray Kurzweil and others around this, future imaginary moment where machines become self-thinking and we become Skynet and we all get to die or merge with the machine.
But China seems to be taking a slightly different approach to AI, and they don't seem to be quite so, or at least they seem to be putting more controls on the direction of travel that they're heading in with that particular technology. I mean, have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'd love to get your thoughts on that as well. But I've noticed as well, from my standpoint, what I've observed, I've been impressed by China's completely different approach to educating their people about the nature of AI and the responsibilities that the people have towards their own minds in dealing with something like as disruptive as AI. And so China's like, you can go to CGTN there and see many documentaries, many presentations where they're encouraging the reading of original texts to develop the philosophical qualities of wisdom within the minds of young people, who will then be able to see where are the limitations of the AI and where are its usefulness. So they're much more considerate in providing that understanding, whereas in the West, there is no such consideration. There's only brainwashing that's being messaged out to convince us that there is only one approach to AI, which is to wait for it to render you extinct, while you go on maybe drugs and video games to distract yourself while you're getting universal basic income, waiting to peter out, as an obsolete machine that couldn't afford to merge with Neuralink. Now in China, it's a different approach. They've also got, because of their national paradigm, or their civilizational paradigm, which is very much driven by a much greater informed set of lived experiences of the deep past than what we have. We've been much more cut off of the positive experiences of the Western society that's been erased from our collective memory. China has greater access to it. So things that happened 2,000 years are having a much more deeper and important impact in shaping their current strategies, especially around things like the revived Silk Road of the Han Dynasty, which has become the foundation philosophically of their current foreign and internal policy of building a community of common principle. As John Quincy Adams had formulated this in the 1820s and 30s, a community of principle would be the only foundation around which a non-Hobbesian structure of humankind could work, where we realize that our self-interest is not in weakening our neighbor, but in helping our neighbor, even if they're different from us, become better. And in doing so, our security, our power of having better business partners, of having more trustworthy neighbors will all improve, which is a truthful thing that, again, we used to have more access to it in saner times in the West, but we've lost it. China, which does have a revival of that, they have national goals that define the behavior of their economy, of their governing class. So they have things like, if you look at recently, they built one of the third largest dam in the world, hydroelectric dam. We haven't built any hydroelectric dams in the West in probably 50 years, since the 70s. China's built, I think, 7 of the 11th biggest dams over the past 30 years. It's all China. And some are really big. Now, this one that I was telling you about, the third biggest in the world, it's massive. It's going to improve the quality of life of so many people, provide abundant electricity, flood controls, you name it, fresh water access. All sorts of good things are happening, but almost no human beings were involved. It was entirely organized by automation a highly organized AI managed system of machines working, and you had some, but very, very, very little human input. But that was machines at the service of the needs of humankind, because it is very dangerous. You don't want to necessarily put people, if you don't have to, through that type of hostile environment working on dams. It's very dangerous, again, very arduous. That, in my mind, is a very good use of AI. But if we don't have a society that has any big visions, big missions that define our next generation's better living standards, which we don't have, then AI will increasingly just be used to pacify, entertain, distract, and control, as I think our static society that's been floating on too many years of consumerism as a drug have allowed ourselves to sort of, we lost that idea of John F. Kennedy's think about the next generation, think about the next 5 generations, which China still has very strong access to. And to the degree that you do, I think all of those dual-use technologies, as AI is one of them, include the atom and atomic power being another one, would be typically used to service that future goal. If you don't have that, then these things will be used typically for more destructive ends.
Let's just this might be a little bit diversionary, but let's just talk a little bit about the Western view of AI. And the way I'm seeing this, I'd be interested in in whether you think I'm even close to the mark here. But how it seems to me is that we during 2021, 2022, during the lockdown period, we demonstrated to people what life would be like sitting on their sofas in front of the television, watching Netflix all day. We paid them to be at home by putting them on furlough schemes and so on. And that, this issue of UBI, because you mentioned it a second ago, has been doing the rounds for many years. And there have been a number of pilot schemes. And of course, the question in most people's minds was, well, where does the money come from to pay for the universal basic income that is going to be handed out for free to people while they sit and watch Netflix? And of course, the answer to that is clear now. It's going to come from AI and robotics doing the productive work, the financial, the money generating part of the work, which humans used to do, but humans will no longer be doing, and therefore it's no problem just to hand them a bung to sit in front of the television. But of course, that life, that vision of what society is going to be like in the future, seems to be one that the billionaire class, the AI billionaire class, gets very excited about. And maybe some people that are finding that the jobs that they are forced to do in the West are not that appealing. Maybe that idea appeals to them as well. But of course, what it absolutely does is put the top on, put the icing on the cake of the sort of panopticon idea that our British Home Secretary is so keen to implement at the moment. It is the final level of control, because of course if you don't behave yourself in the right way, then your universal basic income is taken away, and there's no real economy of any kind for you to take part in, which would allow you to even eat. So this as I see this developing over the next, and actually I think it's going to develop very, very quickly now. It's a pretty dark looking future for people if we don't recognize what is actually going on and consider how we might skirt around this vision that clearly Musk and others have. So what do you think? Am I far off the mark with that assessment?
No, I don't think you're far off the mark at all, unfortunately. I think that's much of what is desired. I started today's chat by just encouraging people to take a step back and to think sometimes as you would one of these sociopathic oligarch types who see themselves as godlike game masters. And I think that when you do that, there's a lot we can work with as far as things that people think, oh, but what happened in the 1930s is so disconnected in time from what we're living in today. There's nothing I just mentioned that China's experiences from 2,000 years ago are having a direct influence in shaping their strategies, in shaping the Belt and Road Initiative, the New Silk Road today, for a good way. That's like a healthy version of learning from the past and how the past affects the future. which, I mean, again, we're shaping the future in the present. But inversely as well, bad toxic ideas. We mentioned feudalism is always the ambition, or the restoration of some form or a variation of feudalism is one of the constants amongst all oligarchically managed societies that believe that human beings are simply another variation of wildlife to be found. If we don't differentiate the qualitative, transcendental nature of the human, the human versus, let's say, the wolf or the cow, if we don't make that differentiation because there's similarities DNA-wise, and we all poop and breathe and eat food and have sex, and so we're all the same. If we just end there, then the consequence of how we choose to organize that type of bestialized society will involve some form of alpha wolves controlling the beta wolves and omega wolves as subspecies, as feudal lords do, thinking of themselves as hereditarily superior masters to inferior born slave families. And so whatever the spin might be, it'll always be the same kind of effect, keeping slaves dumb, pacified, distracted, maybe in a state of terror if possible, if not, at least placate them by giving them an overabundance of stimulation that's hedonistic, that disrupts their ability to think about, well, what freedom is or what's being lost. So that sort of thing is always, in today's world, it's just applying a bit, it's adding to the ancient formula with a bit more technology, as coloring. But in the 1930s, as you mentioned, Elon Musk, his grandfather, Joshua Haldeman, I think, was part of something which is it didn't disappear, let's say that, after World War II. And that thing that Joshua Haldeman, Elon Musk's grandfather, was involved with was Technocracy Incorporated. And anybody looking at the maps of the Technocracy Incorporated, which was an organization set up in 1932 to solve the Great Depression by this guy, Howard Scott. And the idea of this was to simply say, let's get rid of the elected class, let's get rid of the capitalism, it's just corrupt by its nature, and let's create a society of engineers from the top managing regional technates, with the North American technate being part of their study guide. That was sort of the Bible of the Technocracy Incorporated movement, which, again, Elon Musk's grandfather led in Canada. He was the regional director of Canada for that movement. It was quite influential. They had 500,000 members in California alone. It was quite big and getting popular with the despair people were feeling and suffering from the Great Depression. And part of what they wanted was essentially a program of UBI energy credits that would be premised around the notion that you could calculate all consumable goods and the energy associated with all consumable goods and how many people there are consuming those goods, which will be subdivided mathematically to provide credits for the course of the lifespans of those people. Now, what determines the lifespans of those people? And, that's up for question, because this organization was also full of eugenicists who promoted the idea that human beings were just a form of machine, and like machines that can get rusty and obsolete, so too can humans, that you should put in the dumpster when they're too old. So, But all that to say, they sold themselves as a pacifist, the absolutely pacifist organization, yet at the same time, not so genuine, because if your borders are going to expand to Greenland, Canada, Mexico, most of Latin America, Venezuela, Panama, Nicaragua, most of Colombia, if that's really what you see your jurisdiction, those countries are probably not going to just lay down and do it peacefully. So your pacifist, things are probably a lie. That being said, they didn't have the computing power available in those days to properly take the data or calculate the type of data they wanted to. And so it kind of was left in a too ambiguous realm and couldn't quite get the type of hold that Joshua Haldeman and others wanted. By the way, the guy who actually shaped this was a fellow by the name of Thorstein Veblen, who was a...
Well, I was sorry, you'll go on with that in a second, but I was just going to ask, are there parallels to the shape of things to come, actually?
Yes. Yes, and this is where it gets very interesting, because H.G. Wells even said, it doesn't matter if we move through socialism or through capitalism, we can get to world government in either direction.
Right.
And H.G. Wells was a leading Fabian Society thinker, as people know, a big eugenicist, and was also somebody who was sort of a partner, an intellectual partner, dance partner in so many ways with both Julian Huxley as well as Bertrand Russell. They all kind of danced together to play the game of, he was actually the innovator of board games. Actually, H.G. Wells founded Small Wars. That was the name of his first board game in like 1907. And he was basically training, he saw this as a great way to train the young to become potential recruits to a managerial class like he was, because he wasn't from a high family, he wasn't highborn, but he knew that he had certain creative powers that were lacking in many of those overlords that he was devoted to serving, and was very frustrated by the rigidity of the old hereditary classes, and was trying to get them to loosen up a little bit and open up and realize that they need to find ways of making the creative process available to young people in a way that also awoke a sense of wolf-like Hobbesian zero-sum feelings in young people who, by playing these games that became things like Risk and Monopoly and the wars games, would create a psychological framework out of which you could more easily recruit talent that would be useful for managing the type of thing he lays out in his world brain and open conspiracy programs and other things like that. So I think additionally what you said about the things to come story is important, because he's talking about a Soviet of engineers, right? That's what invoked that association in your mind. And that's a big part of his story, is that this world left to human devices alone naturally turns into a plague-ridden, war-ridden hellscape of dystopia. I think he actually innovates the first zombies that later become popular. Later on, he invents that, the walking plague or whatever. And the only people to save the day are these Masonic engineers, the wings of the world that emerge out of the skies to save the war-ridden, sovereign nation-state-ridden world by imposing a higher order from above, which is exactly how Thorsten Veblen was thinking when he called for a mass strike of the engineers in his program for the Technical Alliance. That was a branch of the John Dewey's New School, set up in 1919 as a Fabian Society outlet in New York. This generally was staffed by a lot of figures who went on to create the Council on Foreign Relations in New York in that same 1921 period. Walter Lippmann played a big role in New School as an outgrowth of Columbia. And Thorsten Veblen, again, he was the master mentor of so many of these young disciples like Howard Scott, and he also worked with the Workers of the World Unite to create data sets that involved psychological profiles as well of the workers, to see what do they want, what are they stimulated by, what are they afraid of, what are their corruptions. So it wasn't just simply energy credit or energy data that they were accumulating, or agricultural data, though they were doing that. They were also looking at psychological profiles for their idea of managing human resources. So this is what, again, Elon Musk's grandfather innovates and advances for the Canadian outlet of this agency. And he's arrested for being on the wrong side of World War II, because he's clearly fascist. They're clearly promoting, something which is insurrectionary to our entire way of life, and he has to go on. But I think that, as you said, this UBI thing, it would only work if you completely render the current system defunct through a controlled demolition, as we're witnessing right now. And out of that, maybe a new mathematized type of digital credit could be created that might be associated with the amount of measurable energy and behavior in the system, that people can be allocated certain numbers, and that can be reduced if they behave badly, or maybe rewarded if they do things that please the elites. They might get more bonuses or whatever. But a very, very dangerous idea that didn't disappear after World War II.
And I mean, what you've just described in the last couple of sentences there was I suppose something that we could call social credit. But of course, we've been talking about UBI. There's another economic policy that does the rounds, which is also called social credit by strange coincidence, but was designed by a guy called Douglas. I see a lot of people pushing that idea as a potential solution to our economic woes, but to me it just looks like UBI in other guise.
It is. It absolutely is, and I've seen the same thing. There's a big discussion around social credit in Canada because Canada is one of the few places where it actually gained political power in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. Actually, in British Columbia, it was the dominant political party from 1952 until 1991, except for 3 years. In Alberta as well for many decades. And there's still a certain romanticization of what this is as a philosophy, as a system. But sure enough, you're right. When you do look at Major C.H. Douglas, who was himself a disciple of a certain occultist by the name of Alfred Richard Orage, who was a high-level theosophist, who was a Luciferian, who ran a magazine actually called New Age. He was a Fabian Society member for a number of years. And he's the one who actually he gave the term to Douglas, social credit, to define Douglas's system, because Douglas was publishing in his New Age magazine from 1919, 1920, 1921. And in the Mechanical View of Economics, published by Douglas, he was still trying to find a name for this ephemeral thing. And it was underdeveloped. It was like an undefined idea, but in general form, and this is where Orage says, I got the word, it's social credit. And so he gave it that label. Orage, by the way, was also the disciple and personal assistant to Gurdjieff, another famous occultist who people studying occult espionage and black magic would have encountered Gurdjieff's name. So,
sorry, I don't want to interrupt your train of thought too much, but I'd just like to go a little bit deeper into Gurdjieff, because, of course, if anybody is aware of him at all, it's because he produced a book that's got a quite a famous title, Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, which, if anybody's seen it, I don't know how anybody actually reads it, but that's a whole other issue. But I mean, what was his relationship to intelligence and these kinds of operations?
Okay, for that's such a big one. Let's put that as a future, as a schedule a future chat about that.
Yes.
For the time, because this is an important idea of the social credit thing. I don't want to, and we don't. I don't have only a limited amount of time ahead of us here. So basically, what Douglas did is he serving this network around Orage. So Orage breaks away from the Fabians. People need to know this if they want to understand social credit in 1919 that emerged, or 1920. They need to know what happened in 1912. Why did Orage break with the Fabians? Because he didn't break by himself. There was a controlled sort of bifurcation or splitting off. That's what these occult agencies always seem to do, is they break off in these little disputes, like a hydra with many heads, to create these controlled dialectics. They always create not in ones, but in twos. So they create a left hand or a right hand controlled dialectic, and then they get people to get gravitationally pulled into the debate of, do you want Fabian socialism, top-down state-run controls that completely don't care about really human free will and personal agency so much, like that's all sacrificial to the greater collective concepts? Or do you want some form of bottom-up spin on proto-libertarianism where only the individual matters and not really the collective? That's an absurd, ephemeral idea, but it's all about the individual. Now, in the case of Orage's network that Douglas was a part of, what they did after he split from Fabianism is he started promoting something called guild socialism, the idea of devolving power to local communes. And in Douglas's writings and his many speeches, he makes the point that not only should, in an abstract sense, power be devolved from the nation state, which he doesn't even believe should exist, is he says nation states actually should not be tolerated because they're outlets of corruption and control. We should devolve power, as well as he says that, and I've got a big quote from him, describing how industrial civilization itself is a corrupt aberration, and that we should go back to energy-intensive forms of artisanry. So you could see clearly the fault or the thoughts of people like John Ruskin and William Morris, who were sort of the founders of this guild socialist, pre-Raphaelite romanticization of medievalism, pre-nation state medievalism, pre-Renaissance medievalism, which is influencing Orage. It's influencing Ruskin and Morris are everywhere here. So they're creating this idea that, okay, if we just had these beautiful little utopian communes without advanced technology, then we would all have liberty and freedom, and we would have progress and abundance, and naturally, again, it gets very, very, it's like magical thinking that people will just organize into self-organized systems, and then progress will happen, corruption will disappear, and we'll have this future that's great. But planning is bad. In any type of role of a nation planning something for the future, as China is doing now with the BRI, or as the U.S. had done under JFK or FDR or whatever, or Lincoln, that's bad. That should be eliminated. And so, yeah, he was marketing his stuff actually, just like Keynes was actually propping him up. So John Maynard Keynes, another Fabian, who was all about top-down planning, was actually propping up Douglas by citing him in his general theory. Both Keynes and Douglas were writing letters to the Nazi high command, to Hitler directly, which is all available, both Keynes and Douglas, marketing their systems to the Nazis, making the point that the Nazi type of governing system is ideal for each one. Now, the problem is, the irony is that each one appears to be opposing. One seems to all be about bottom-up emergent self-organization. The other one's all about top-down national planning, but they're working together. It's a controlled dialectic, and they both correctly identify that their systems. And it actually wasn't a letter by Keynes, by the way. It was his preface in his German edition of the 1936 General Theory. For those who might want to say, hey, he never wrote a letter. He wrote the General Theory, the preface, and he says, it's in Hitler's Germany that you would find the best application for my system. It doesn't work under democracies. So, you got this thing, and the fact that Joshua Haldeman is moving from Technocracy, Inc., which he's running for until he's arrested in 1940, and it's made illegal because now we're in World War II. He immediately goes on to become the head of the Social Credit Party of Canada, or of Saskatchewan, sorry. And he does that from 1943 up until 1949. He's running for office, and he's pushing social credit, which you would think is the opposite of what he was pushing with Technocracy, Inc., or earlier when he was working for 3 years as the head of the Fabian Society of Canada, which is what he did from 1933 until 1936, is Joshua Haldeman was the head and founder of the Fabian Society of Saskatchewan, which meant he was directly receiving orders, or at least working with 5 Rhodes Scholars, who were the founders of the Fabian Society, many of whom were pushing eugenics anyway, and the replacement of capitalism and democracy by a managerial class of elites. That's what the Fabian Society wants and always wanted. And their Canadian branch became known as the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. That became known as the NDP today, the Orange Party, which is the middle party, and it merged in the 60s with the Liberals. So they pretty much became one thing. And I mean, I say merged, they still exist, but pretty much all of the Pierre Elliott Trudeau was an NDP technocrat, and he basically went with all of his fellow NDP technocrats and became liberals to gain political power. So I'm saying that, they didn't merge officially, but they merged in essence. And that's what Joshua Haldeman, so he has these 3 phases in his Canadian political career, all of which seem different in different ways, but they're actually identically driven by the same agenda of maximizing the illusion of personal liberty from the bottom-up perspective, but maximizing the reality of top-down controls by a world governing class, which is why also, I'll just say this, even globalist eugenicists like Bertrand Russell also is a self-professed anarcho-syndicalist who says that that's the best form of organizing society, at the same time as he's proposing and fighting for one world government under a managerial class. As is Elon Musk, who actually wrote a tweet 2 years ago saying anarcho-syndicalism for the win, as at the same time, in the same day that he was calling for a Martian technate. So you've got the same language, the same naming protocols as well by Elon and company, who are all transhumanists. They think in the same terms as those I was just referring to, as far as human beings being machines to be merged with other machines if they want to stay relevant, because we're inferior biological machines. They promote the idea of drugs and video games to distract the useless eaters who will be made irrelevant. And, Peter Thiel, Elon, who were incubated in South Africa, where Joshua Haldeman went in 1949 when he got too exasperated by the lack of acceptance of his doctrines. He went to the freest place in the world and began promoting. He became essentially a promoter and a publisher of conspiratorial anti-Jewish narratives of, republishing the Protocols of Zion, which is what Major Douglas was also promoting with Araj, as well as the Canadian Social Credit Party, which was the only party to impose eugenics as well and support eugenics and sterilization of the unfit, especially natives, but across the board in Canada. in the 1940s, 50s onward, they were also promoting, they were the only political party promoting and publishing the Protocols of Zion that are provable forgeries cooked up by the Theosophists themselves, decades earlier. And that's what Elon Musk's grandfather is also citing and promoting in South Africa, which is, he's arriving at the beginning of apartheid, which, I mean, I hope I don't have to say anything to the audience about why that was a bad idea. But that's where Elon and Peter Thiel are incubated and are grown out of this sort of like Nazi utopian environment of districts and, identity cards that give people mobility rights or don't in South Africa. That was what was done under a very, very, I would say that there's probably a lot of unreconstructed Nazi controllers who are probably active managing that shit show that inspired Elon's grandfather and father and probably himself to a certain degree, I would say.
Yes. Wow. Where do we go from there? So
I could say more, but I think but here's the thing, right? Like a lot of people, they want to believe so badly that, Elon is this great genius that, Tesla, you can even say a word about that too, right? Like the fact that Tesla was also in New York in 5-star hotels in the 1920s. Tesla's also on record calling for a global system run by eugenicists, and he's on record in interviews with Hitler's principal lieutenant in America, George Sylvester Viereck, in 1933.
But this can't be right, because Tesla is held up by freedom advocates as being the man whose fantastic inventions would have changed the world, and he's suppressed by the globalists, right?
It's a magic trick. People are getting duped by a magic trick. But yeah, no, it's actually, it's a big part of my book on Rosicrucian Golem here. And I tell a lot of the story about the interfacing of Tesla and these technocrats and eugenicists as part of a big magic trick that is transgenerational in its effects. The idea was not to necessarily act upon the world that they were acting on, but to create a narrative foundation that would obscure the source of real discoveries that were misattributed to a Tesla as a cardboard synthetic, sort of self-identified human automaton. He didn't believe he had a soul. He didn't believe that souls existed. He believed that he was a machine that had been endowed by special clairvoyant powers to see things from the beyond. So he had a sort of mystical self-identity that made him perfectly pliable, because he was very much full of himself too, as was people like Isaac Newton and other Rosicrucian-affiliated pseudoscientists who were marketed to the world as being the great sources of the discoveries that were actually made by real engineers and scientists who were being creative, but whose ideas had to be stolen and repackaged and attributed to somebody, right? In this case, it was Tesla. For most of his ideas, you could find them actually sourced by other greater minds than he. But he had handlers, he had managers. I mentioned here George Sylvester Viereck as the guy who went to jail because he was Hitler's top lieutenant in America, working to spread Nazi propaganda all across the United States with senators in Congress that were on his payroll. And this is the guy who Tesla practically lived with and wrote poems, weird poems in homage to the greatness of Viereck. Viereck is one of the first people, if you read his writings in 1933, exposing the Federal Reserve. He sounds like Alex Jones. He sounds like the type of Eustace Mullins conspiratorial narratives that we here tend to encounter. But the reason why is Eustace Mullins was the disciple of Viereck. Viereck himself was a disciple of Crowley. They were doing black magic rituals in Long Island together. Openly, and there's books that have been written about their association. So you got one degree of separation between Aleister Crowley, a British agent, a British secret agent, 666 in America, organizing to pull the USA into World War I. He's still at it in World War II, building up a whole network of occult black magicians, pushing fascism, which is also at the heart of fascism in Nazi Germany, is a black magician class of Thule Society, New Templar freaks, trying to invoke demons and usher in an age of Horus or an age of whatever Odin for a 1,000-year millennial Reich. So you got these same networks everywhere overlapping each other, and you've got these things like the blue shirts of Adrian Arcand working with the Social Credit Party. The Social Credit Party, sorry, I'm just spewing out stuff here, but anyway, the Social Credit Party they are the green shirts. They actually have berets, and they have a whole, fascist-inspired uniform system called the green shirts. They're working with the Adrian Archon blue shirts. They're sometimes at battle with the black shirts of Oswald Mosley. But they're all kind of like the Technocracy Inc. are the gray shirts. They actually
but look, the grandson of Oswald Mosley is currently head of Palantir UK. So again, we've got the connections back into Technocracy once again. So these people never stray far from they're never too far away, are they?
They're never too far away. They like keeping this in the family. And I think you mentioned to me the other day that you got the MI6 director as well, whose grandfather had some peculiar relationships in Ukraine in the World War II period too, right?
Absolutely. So we never have to go too far. Look, you said you were just spewing stuff out there, but actually, this stuff is really important to understand because we are in a world where we have these types of networks apparently at each other's throats. On steroids, how are we to conclude this for today, because this conversation needs to continue, but how do people decipher or get a picture of modern events, of current events, and the types of people that are appearing to be at each other's throats when in fact they're working ultimately to the same agenda? How are people supposed to interpret what they're seeing in front of them?
I mean, I think if they're watching this show, they're already in a pretty good place as far as progress to wrap their minds around things that they've been told are unthinkable. No, we have to go to the places that we're being told are forbidden in this realm. So that's a good start. I think that what I've tried to do with my wife Cynthia is make a lot of these seemingly complex, but actually not super complex ideas as intelligible as possible through our books that we've published. We've done the Clash of the Two Americas book series. It's 4 volumes, The Untold History of Canada. I wrote that over the course of a decade. That's 4 volumes of reconstructions of Canadian history. They're all short too. They're not too long. And our Science Unshackled books, our Revenge of the Mystery books, Mystery Cults, Cynthia's books on the Black Sun. Any one of these could be a good entry point to begin. I would. Not to toot my own horn, I just think that's why we did them. So you're asking.
No, you're welcome to toot your own horn. I mean, this is this all helps.
I feel sometimes it's maybe a bit presumptuous of me, but we also do a lot of documentaries, and I think the thing to focus on is where did the oligarchy fail? Because the way a lot of the conspiratorial research is framed that is available and has become very popular, especially in the post-COVID age, is to map out all of the ways the oligarchy has gained power, enjoyed forever power, has been evil, doing evil. But there's very little focus on the times and moments in history where they've failed to succeed what they want to do. And I think that for me has been one of the most important attitudes that I adopted early on, is to obsessively try to focus on discover where are those moments where the oligarchy tried to do something and were prevented, were blocked, were flanked by human beings thinking like human beings on a much higher creative and I think a level of natural law that's in tune with God's law. I mentioned the Chinese flank of the Han Dynasty's their creation of the Silk Road of 2,000 years ago was one of these fantastic ways of breaking free of that system of controls by a high priesthood that wants to keep people fighting and divided and in ignorance. That was a great way of doing it, and it lasted for a while, but it was sabotaged eventually. There's different moments in history where I've tried to sort of zero in and shed light on where did the Crusades, which were supposed to have begun 200 years earlier than they did, how did greater minds, more dignified minds, like those allies of Charlemagne and Alcuin, who were part of the Carolingian world, work with their Muslim counterparts to create alliances and to create sharing of information with Jewish networks and Chinese networks as well from the Tang Dynasty, who were all able to collaborate, to work together to create an idea that our self-interest and our destiny is much more in harmony than at discord, and it's all tied to creating Renaissance movements. And so these things that gave rise to the American Revolution, the best of what Lincoln did, the best of what we saw in why did Hitler lose World War II when all of these bankers were funding him and all of these occultists were backing his movement? Why did that not succeed when it was supposed to? Why did they abort that? So these types of that way of thinking, I think, is just more valuable than simply mapping out the evil alone. But it gives your people the strength to see, well, where are the weak kinks in this very intimidating looking armor of this parasitical ancient evil? So there are weaknesses, there are insecurities that it has that I think are being acted upon in an authentic manner by, you know, many of those leading policy right now in China especially, but many of its allies are doing things that might be flawed. It's not the same. You know, we didn't even talk about how this social credit is different from that social credit, which maybe that could be a future chat we do.
Yeah, we did. Yeah, we need to do that too. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
But all that to say, it's like this is the sort of thing that I think would empower people to understand, like, what are the practicable options available, even if they are unlikely, because we've wasted time. Decades have been wasted in letting ourselves mentally and morally and physically entropy as human Western human civilization. We did that to ourselves. We allowed that, at least. I mean, you could say the oligarchy did it to us, but we allowed it as well. It happened with our consent. So, yes, you know, it's more difficult than it would have been maybe when, you know, Bobby Kennedy was alive 60 years ago, but it's still practicable. We see that China has given us something to work with as far as a way of thinking about global self-interest and avoiding wars and what have you. But we have to just, I think, get over our prejudices, be more courageous in terms of thinking about what type of thoughts we're capable of lifting. It's like a gym, you know. We tend to want to stick with the easy thoughts that are lighter, but those are actually useless and in the long run going to kill us. And I think we have to just allow ourselves to press on the unknown a little bit more, with more confidence in ourselves, that we understand that we can make the discoveries by leaning into the unknown and building on discovery after discovery to have real knowledge instead of something we've memorized from a persuasive influencer that we're listening to that gives us things we write down. But it's not really a power of changing things. It's power more of just knowing how screwed we are, which is often what often, you know, we see in the echo chambers of the internet these days too. You know, so that's
yes,
my words of wisdom, as I hope they are.
Okay, well, Matt, let's leave it there, because that's a great place to end for today. We've clearly got two programs more to do at the very least: the social credit versus social credit conversation, and also Gurdjieff, because Gurdjieff, I think I'd like to know a lot more about, and so we'll do that in the not too distant future. So look, thank you very much for joining us today, and we'll keep you posted on any responses. There'll be information about how to find Matt's work in the show notes, of course, so do support if possible, and thanks everyone for watching. See you next time. Bye bye.